Hi, I'm Becky Johnson with Sweetheart Quilt Design Company, and we're here today to talk about sampler quilts and block sizes in the sampler quilts. So first I wanted to let you know what a sampler quilt is. This is my Quilting 102 quilt, which is a sampler quilt. So what it means is it has different blocks in it. All the blocks are different. Sometimes they'll all be different. Sometimes you'll have two of each block. This is a sampler quilt. They're all different. And that one over there is a sampler quilt. All the blocks are different. I mean, there's setting blocks just like this one has, but then the rest of them are different. So that's what a sampler quilt is. So the gal asked, what do I do when I make my blocks and they're different sizes? So first I'm going to do a little troubleshooting on how that happens, why it happens, and then we're going to do a little bit of what do I do about it. So the first thing that you need to pay attention to is if the blocks were all written the same size. So if you're doing a pattern like this Quilting 102 or Quilting 101, those blocks are all designed to be finished 12 inches, so unfinished 12 and a half. If you're making up your own sampler quilt, you might be pulling in a 10-inch block and a 12-inch block. So in that case, you're going to have to like frame the smaller blocks or do something different in order to make them fit. Now, if you're making blocks that were all designed to be 12 inches, but they don't come out 12 inches or 12 and a half unfinished. Why would that be? So the basics, a couple of the basics in quilting, first one is cutting accuracy. So you want to make sure that when they tell you to cut 2.5 inches, you're cutting 2.5 inches, and it's not 2.5 inches at one end and 2 3/8 at the other side of the block, or that kind of thing. So you want to double check your cutting. And I do have a YouTube video on cutting, how to cut. The next thing is seam allowance. In quilting, and quilt patterns are designed to use a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. So that's about 1 thread less than a 1/4 inch. So if you have your seams and you put the edge of your ruler on the stitching, then the line of your ruler, the 1/4 inch line, should just barely be off the side of the fabric. And that's how you know you've got the right size. If it's bigger, you'll shrink the block. If it's smaller, you'll make it bigger. And you can say, but is it really that big a deal? As long as I'm consistent, isn't that okay? And let me show you an example here. So this is a block right here. And you notice in this block, there's 2 seams. So as I'm going across, so say I'm a 1/16 of an inch, not very big, off on my seam allowance. But since there's 2 pieces of fabric there, it's doubled. So that makes an 1/8 of an inch. And there's 2 seams, so that makes a 1/4 inch. So my block just became a 1/4 inch smaller. Or as you're looking across this section of the block, there's 4 seams. So that's going to be a 1/2 inch smaller. Now look at this particular block. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 seams. So if you're off an 1/8 of an inch per seam, that's a whole inch smaller. So it really, really does matter that you learn how to do an accurate scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. It's very important. We do the scant because we press our seams to one side. It takes just a little bit of fabric to do that. And we don't want to take it out of the top of the block. Most machines, most sewing machine companies offer 1/4 inch foot, 1/4 inch quilter's foot. Some of them have a guide on the side, some of them don't. You just work with the edge of the presser foot. So whatever you like, on my machine, I adjust my needle position. And I tested it, I fiddled with it until I got the right adjustment so I get my seam allowance correct. Now, another thing that can be going wrong is ironing. So I made up this block just to show some examples of troubleshooting on blocks. So right here, and this happens, you can see this, how this I call these tuckies. So when you pull it back, look at all that extra. There's a whole 1/8 of an inch in there from that tucky. And this happens when you press from the back, and I made other mistakes here on purpose. And then you're not looking at the front. You always want to press your quilt from the front because that's what everybody's going to look at. That's what you're going to look at. And these little tucky things, they shrink your block. And they also can catch when it's quilted. They can pop open. So you want to make sure you press from the top. Look at your block and make sure it's straight or it's pressed flat. And I talk about all this stuff in Quilting 101. You can sign up at our classes site for that when we go over all of this stuff. I also, in Quilting 102 and all my classes, I talk about the accuracy. Okay, just checking my notes. Another thing you can do is if you don't nest your seams. So on this block, like I said, I made mistakes on purpose, but the seams aren't nested. It sticks out that way and then it's in this way. So if you're going with the smaller one, then your block is smaller. And by not nesting, you can see how these don't come together. Okay, so what do you do about it if your blocks are the wrong size? Okay, first suggestion, groan, but try starting over and cutting the block again and paying attention to the accuracy of your cutting, paying attention to your seam allowance and your pressing. And I know it's groan, I don't want to do that. However, it will be invaluable experience and take you so much further forward in quilting to go back and learn how to do it right. Just take a little extra time now for sewing happiness in the future. Another thing people ask me is, can I trim the block if it's too big? So when you're working with something like this, where it's all square, and you need to trim off 1/8 of an inch or something, then you can set it up. And this one's been sewn in, or you'd see how it lays. But you could trim all 4 sides evenly, and you could probably get away with that. But if you are trimming like this block, so you have your seam allowance, if you take that and see already right here, when you sew it in, you're going to chop off the point. If you trim the seam allowance down to here, you're going to chop off the point. So you have to be extremely careful with that. So if you have blocks that are smaller and bigger, unless they're all just squares, rectangles, you can't really trim them down very well. So then you're making the smaller ones bigger, which you can put narrow borders around. If you did that, you'd want to make sure you match your background, because it's very difficult to put narrow borders on and have them look good. Or you could put accent borders on and have it be an on-purpose thing. That would look cute. So there's a few ideas. When I teach Quilting 101 and Quilting 102, I give tips on when you're sewing your blocks into your quilt. If it doesn't quite fit, how do you make it work? How do you make it fit? So those classes will help you learn how to do that. So anyway, I hope that helps you and gives you some ideas. and spurs you on to a lot more happy quilting. Talk to you next time. Thanks.